For 3 days, the Reading and Northern would detour the North Reading Fast Freight in the Lehigh Gorge, utilizing Norfolk Southern's Upper Lehigh line, while Reading and Northern maintenance of way crews performed retaining wall work near milepost 124. These trains would enter the Lehigh Gorge via river as normal. Our friend Mike was on scene for the first day of the detour. After clearing river, NRFF would slow for coal and stop before being given the okay to proceed with the train past the switch at coal. Here is where the detour would start. NRFF would now shove roughly 4 miles on the Lehighton branch to Lehigh Valley's former Packarding Yard. What makes this detour possible is NS and Reading and Northern each owning a track of the former Lehigh Valley double-track main line. In Packarding, the North Reading Fast Freight would wait for track authority from Norfolk Southern before proceeding onto the Norfolk Southern Upper Lehigh line. Due to the detour requiring lengthy shove moves, the North Reading Fast Freight would have an additional feature, a caboose, or 2 on this day. With the shove move complete and track authority for the Upper Lehigh line given, the North Reading Fast Freight comes hauling through downtown Jim Thorpe. First we get a bird's eye view from Mike, and then he takes us to the ground to see the entire train. The North Reading Fast Freight would proceed up the Upper Lehigh line to what Norfolk Southern refers to as M&H Junction. It's also known as Independence on the Reading and Northern, or what was known as Penn Haven Junction in the Lehigh Valley and Central Railroad of New Jersey days. At this location, the fast freight would revert to home rails and continue to Penobscot and Mountaintop, PA. Due to the detour, the North Reading Fast Freight would meet the piston yard job at Penobscot to swap cars before returning south. Mike would return at night for the southbound run back to North Reading, catching the North Reading Fast Freight at Glenanoka and Jim Thorpe Market, heading south on the Upper Lehigh line. Mike would capture the entire train before heading to Cole. We had assumed they would shove back up the Lehighton branch to Cole, then proceed towards North Reading. But for the southbound run, things were changed. The North Reading Fast Freight would shove up the Jim Thorpe branch, past the Jim Thorpe station, through Nesquehoning Junction, and Two River. Then they would proceed south. Mike still was able to capture action at Cole, as well as a bonus. Norfolk Southern H66 would pass by the North Reading Fast Freight at Cole. Now at Cole, Mike captures the caboose, clearing Cole as the train shoves to clear the switch at River. H-66 would then come into view for a meet in the dark. With the North Reading Fast Freight getting a green light at River, the train departs for North Reading and will wrap up day one of the detour as we watch the caboose disappear into the darkness. Day 2 would be the first Cam and I joined Mike for some detour action. This time some aerial video from Mike of the Reading and Northern's North Reading Fast Freight entering the Lehigh Gorge at River with a great 6-engine lashup, SD40-2s 3068, 3050, 3064, SD50-2 5020, SD50M 5017, and GP39RN 2531. From this angle you can get a good idea of how this detour move works going northbound. As the North Reading Fast Freight crosses over the Reading and Northern's Lehighton branch and the Norfolk Southern Upper Lehigh line, the train basically backs down on one track and comes back up on the other. Also, the weather changes drastically during this shove move after this clip, only to be sunny again for the run up the Upper Lehigh line. Summer showers. After catching the train at River, Mike would catch the shove move entering the Narrows at the curve around Bear Mountain, also the grade crossing for access to the Jim Thorpe sewer plant. The Narrows is a tight straight section of the Lehigh Gorge between Bear Mountain Curve and the Packardon Bridge. The tracks here cross over the Lehigh River to Packardon Junction, where all tracks end up being on the same side of the Lehigh River. At Packardon Junction, the Reading and Northern Jim Thorpe branch connects to the Norfolk Southern Upper Lehigh line. The Lehighton branch of the Reading and Northern connects with the Upper Lehigh line closer to Packardon itself. The Narrows provide some stunning views, and for the return up the Upper Lehigh line, Mike and I were able to capture the North Reading Fast Freight entering and exiting the Narrows in Notch 8, as well as an aerial view of the Narrows itself. In the aerial view, look for PA Route 209 on the opposite mountain, as this is where it begins its drop into Jim Thorpe. We will enjoy the coming views and be back for the Day 2 southbound run. Also, one neat thing that showed up in today's consist was the Reading and Northern tank car, which we'll see quite a few times with a few of the clips coming up. As well as, watch for it to return in the Day 3 southbound run as it returns south on that train. Mike would make a trip to Jim Thorpe Station for the southbound trip on day 2. Having already traversed the upper Lehigh line past Packerton Junction, the North Reading Fast Freight is now shoving its train through downtown Jim Thorpe en route for River. Once clear of River, the train would proceed south on the Reading and Northern Main to the North Reading. This detour move at night gave the chance to catch a large freight train at Jim Thorpe Station. Pretty neat to see. This clip will also end our day 2 coverage of the fast freight detour over the upper Lehigh line. Day 3 would be the last day the North Reading Fast Freight would be required to detour. Cam and I were able to make it to Jim Thorpe Market just in time for the shove move to Packard's. Shoving on the front would be another 6-engine lashup with SD40-2s, 3068, 3050, 3064, SD50-2 5020, SD50M 5017, and GP38-2 2011. Since these detour trains took place during the week, Cam and I were just making it to Jim Thorpe after I got home from work. On day 2, we sat in traffic and watched as the North Reading Fast Freight shoved through Jim Thorpe. On day 1, we had a baseball game. We weren't able to get out and see it. So we are very grateful for what Mike captured and provided to make this video what it is. Day 3 was the only day Mike missed the northbound run, but he does close out our video coverage of the detour trains with the southbound run, showing the southbound run shoving past river and then proceeding south on the Reading and Northern Main Line. After this shot we are now viewing, Cam and I would end our coverage of the detour with one final shot at Coalport with the North Reading Fast Freight passing under the Reading and Northern Main Line while on the upper Lehigh line. We hope you enjoyed our coverage of the North Reading Fast Freight Detour on the Upper Lehigh Line in August of 2024. And a huge thanks to Mike, who made this video possible with all his stunning captures of the detour over the 3 days it took place. We thank you, Mike, and everyone, please give a thanks to Mike if you leave a comment. Thank you.